In March 1809, Thomas Jefferson walked out of the White House for the last time as President of the United States, leaving behind a country both stronger and more vulnerable than ever before. Under his leadership, the US had doubled in size, expanded its influence westward, and secured a legal system that would shape the young nation for generations. But his final years in the office were far from triumphant. His Embargo Act had crippled the economy, and tensions with Britain and Native American tribes on the frontier are rising. As he retired to Monticello, his successor and closest ally, James Madison, stepped into the presidency, inheriting a nation on the brink of war. Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, was a brilliant political thinker, but he was about to face his greatest challenge yet. The British were harassing American ships, arming Native American resistance, and treating the young republic with utter disregard. And so, in 1812, just 3 decades after the Revolutionary War, the United States found itself at war once again, this time against the very empire it had fought to free itself from. Hello and welcome back to the US History Understanding This Country. I am Santosh, and today we dive into episode number 16, The War of 1812, America's second fight for independence. In this episode, we will explore how Tecumseh and Native American resistance fueled tensions on the frontier, how the Battle of Tippecanoe became a rallying cry for war, and how British attacks on Washington D.C. led to the burning of the White House. We will also uncover the origins of the Star-Spangled Banner and the legendary Battle of New Orleans. And of course, the surprising end to the war that a few people truly won, yet everyone claimed victory. Before we begin, a quick reminder: if you are enjoying this podcast, please follow, rate, and share US History Understanding This Country. Your support helps keep this series going, and I appreciate each and every one of you tuning in. By the early 19th century, the United States was expanding westward at a relentless pace, pushing deeper into the Native American lands. White settlers, eager for a new farmland, crossed the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley and Indiana Territory, often violating treaties that had been made and broken countless times before. For Native American tribes, the message was clear: the US government would not stop until every inch of their land was gone. Among the many leaders who resisted this encroachment, one name stood above rest: Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a Shawnee warrior, diplomat, and visionary unlike any native leader before him. He was not just fighting to defend his own tribe's land, he had a larger vision, a dream of unifying all Native American nations east of Mississippi into a single powerful confederation. His goal? To stand together against the United States, refusing to sell any more land and pushing back against white settlement. His movement gained strength throughout the early 1800s, and he traveled extensively, persuading tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico to join his cause. He was charismatic, strategic, and relentless, arguing that individual tribes could no longer negotiate treaties separately because each time one did, they weakened all native nations. But Tecumseh was not just relying on alliances. He found an unexpected ally across the Atlantic: Britain. The British, still bitter over their defeat in the Revolutionary War, saw Tecumseh's confederation as a useful tool against growing power of the United States. They supplied the native warriors with weapons and support, fueling tensions along the frontier. Tecumseh's greatest challenge, however, was not just the US military. It was time. Many tribal leaders hesitated to commit fully to his confederation, fearing retaliation from the Americans. And while Tecumseh was away gathering support, his movement suffered a devastating blow. In 1811, while Tecumseh was in the south recruiting allies, his brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, led an ill-fated attack on the US forces at Tippecanoe Creek. What followed was a brutal and decisive battle that would become one of the key sparks leading the War of 1812. Unlike Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa was not a warrior, he was a spiritual leader who claimed to have visions from the Great Spirit. He preached a message of revival and resistance, urging native tribes to reject American influence, abandon European goods, and stand firm against white encroachment. His words inspired many, but they also made Prophetstown a target. On the other side of the conflict stood William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory. Harrison had long been wary of Tecumseh's growing influence, viewing the Confederation as a direct challenge to American expansion. He had tried to weaken the movement by signing treaties with individual tribes, but Tecumseh's refusal to recognize these agreements made clear that the Shawnee leader would not be bribed or negotiated with. With Tecumseh away, Harrison saw an opportunity. In November 1811, he led about 1,000 US troops towards Prophetstown, demanding the native forces to disband. Though Tenskwatawa had no military experience, he convinced his warriors that they would be protected by spiritual forces, claiming that American bullets would not harm them. Under this belief, native fighters launched a pre dawn attack on Harrison's forces on November 7, 1811. The battle was short but brutal. US forces, better armed and trained, repelled the attack and burned Prophetstown to the ground. Dozens of native warriors were killed, and though Harrison's army also suffered losses, he declared victory. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a devastating blow to Tecumseh's movement. The destruction of Prophetstown weakened the Confederation, and Tenskwatawa's reputation as a prophet was shattered. Many of his followers now saw him as a fraud for falsely promising divine protection. But this was not the end of Tecumseh's resistance. Far from it. The Battle of Tippecanoe would become one of the key sparks that pushed the United States into the War of 1812. Americans, already furious about British interference, saw Britain's support for native forces as a proof that war was inevitable. As news of Battle of Tippecanoe spread across the United States, the response was immediate and furious that Britain was actively working against American expansion and sovereignty. For years, tension had been simmering between the US and Britain over trade restrictions and maritime rights. The British Navy, in its ongoing war against Napoleon's France, had been harassing American ships, blocking trade, and even forcing American sailors into British service through a practice called impressment. These humiliations had been piling up, and now, with Native American resistance on the frontier being linked directly to the British aid, far fever swept through the country. Leading the charge for the war was a group of young, aggressive congressmen known as the War Hawks. These were not the older generation of leaders who had fought in the Revolutionary War. These were new political voices determined to prove that America was strong and would not be pushed around. The most famous among them were Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. To the War Hawks, this was not just about native resistance or maritime disputes. This was about defending American honor and sovereignty. They believed that Britain was treating the US like a second class power, and the only way to command respect was through military action. Many of them also had their eyes on Canada, arguing that if war broke out, the US could easily invade and conquer British held Canada, expanding American territory in the process. But not everyone in Congress was convinced. Federalists in New England opposed the war, fearing it would cripple trade and bring further economic hardship. They still had strong commercial ties with Britain and worried that war would do more harm than good. President James Madison too was hesitant. Unlike Jefferson, who had preferred economic pressure over war, Madison was facing a divided nation, one that was calling for action but not unanimously. Yet, momentum was too strong to resist. By June 1812, the pressure from the war hawks had become overwhelming. President Madison reluctantly asked Congress for a declaration of war against Britain. It was a bold move, but one that could test the young American Republic like never before. President James Madison now led the country into what many called the Second War of Independence. But while the war hawks had painted a picture of quick and easy victory, reality would prove to be far more complicated. The United States was woefully prepared for war. Unlike the British, who had a powerful navy and battle hardened troops, America's military was small, underfunded, and lacking strong leadership. Years of Jeffersonian policies had weakened the standing army, and the navy, though skilled, was tiny compared to Britain's vast fleet. Many Americans believed that the key to victory was a swift invasion of Canada, the nearest British territory. Warhawks like Henry Clay confidently predicted that Canadians unhappy with British rule would welcome American troops as liberators. Former President Thomas Jefferson even remarked that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. They were dead wrong. The first major campaign of the war, a three-pronged invasion of Canada, ended in disaster. American forces, poorly organized and badly led, were quickly repelled by British troops and Canadian militias. In August 1812, Detroit fell without a fight, and other US offensives stalled. Rather than capturing new territory, the Americans found themselves on the defensive. On the seas, the story was much the same. The Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world, blockaded the American coast, choking off trades and causing economic hardship. American ships, though few in number, won some impressive naval battles, including the famous duel between USS Constitution, or the Old Ironsides, and the HMS Guerriere. But these victories were not enough to turn the tide. As the war dragged on, it became clear that this was not going to be an easy victory that the war hawks had promised. The United States was fighting against one of the world's strongest military powers, and its survival would depend on endurance, strategy, and a bit of luck. And then, in 1814, the war reached the very heart of the young American Republic as British forces launched an attack on Washington D.C. itself. By the summer of 1814, the war had taken devastating turns for the United States. Britain, having finally defeated Napoleon in Europe, could now focus its full military strength on the war in America. With thousands of experienced troops freed from the European battlefield, Britain planned a major offensive against the US, targeting key cities along the East Coast. That's when they targeted the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. In August 1814, a British fleet carrying nearly 4,500 troops under the command of Major General Robert Ross sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, landing in Maryland. From there, British forces marched towards Washington, facing little resistance from the outnumbered and unprepared American defenders. At the Battle of Bladensburg, just outside the capital, American troops, many of them poorly trained militia, broke ranks and fled in panic. President James Madison himself had to escape the battlefield, narrowly avoiding capture. With American forces in retreat, the road to Washington lay wide open. On the night of August 24, 1814, British troops entered the city and set it ablaze. They torched the White House, the US Capitol, and other government buildings, sending flames and smoke into the night sky. The First Lady Dolly Madison famously saved a portrait of George Washington before fleeing the White House, ensuring that one of the nation's most cherished symbols would not be lost to the flames. For the British, this was revenge, payback for the American burning of York, the modern day Toronto. For Americans, it was a moment of national humiliation, a stark reminder that their young nation was still vulnerable. Yet, in a strange twist of fate, nature itself intervened. A massive storm, possibly a hurricane, struck Washington, bringing torrential rain and high winds that helped extinguish the fires. Some reports even claim that a tornado swept through the British ranks, forcing them to withdraw sooner than planned. Despite the destruction, the attack on Washington was more symbolic than strategic. The British had no intention of occupying the capital. Their real target was Baltimore, home to one of the most important American ports. And it was there, in the coming weeks, that America's national anthem would be born. Unlike the capital, Baltimore was well defended with a strong militia and fortifications ready to repel the British assault. On September 13, 1814, British warships began a relentless bombardment of Fort McHenry, the key to Baltimore's defense. For 25 straight hours, cannons and rockets lit up the night sky, shaking the fort's walls and raining destruction on the defenders. The British expected the fort to surrender under the relentless assault. Watching from a British ship where he was being held as a temporary prisoner was Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer and poet. He had traveled to the British fleet to negotiate the release of an American prisoner. But now he was stuck, forced to witness the attack unfold from the water. All night long, Key anxiously watched as British shells exploded over the fort. As dawn broke on September 14th, he strained to see through the haze of smoke and fire. And then, in the early morning light, he saw it, the American flag still flying proudly over Fort McHenry. Inspired by the sight, he scribbled down the first line of the poem. Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light. That poem, originally titled The Defense of Fort McHenry, would later be set to the tune of a popular British melody and renamed the Star-Spangled Banner. In 1931, it would officially become the national anthem of the United States. The British assault on Baltimore ultimately failed, marking a turning point in the war. But the flag that flew over Fort McHenry that night became more than just a military symbol, it became a national icon, a testament to the resilience of the American people. Yet, the war was not over. Two of the most critical battles, the Battle of Lake Champlain and Battle of New Orleans, were still to come. After the British burned Washington D.C., many Americans began to rebuild not just the city but also their national pride. This moment of destruction and renewal also gives us a chance to clear up one of the most common linguistic confusion, the difference between capital and capital. The words sound the same, but they mean very different things. Capital with an A refers to the city that serves as the seat of government, like Washington D.C., the capital of United States, or New Delhi, the capital of India. But capital with an O refers specifically to a building where the government meets, like the US state capitol, where Congress convenes. So, when we say that the British burnt the US Capitol, we are talking about the actual building, not the city itself. But when we say the capital was attacked, we mean that Washington D.C. as a whole under siege. This distinction is important because it applies to state governments as well. Every US state has a capital city and a capital building where its legislature meets. It's a small detail, but one worth remembering, especially when discussing a war where both capital and the capital were in flames. As 1814 drew a close, the War of 1812 was reaching its most decisive moments. While the British assault on Baltimore had failed, they were still determined to force the United States into submission. With their European war against Napoleon over, Britain could now devote more troops and resources to crushing the American resistance. But two final battles, one in the north and one in the south, would turn the tide and ultimately shape the war's conclusion. In September 1814, the British launched a major offensive from Canada, aiming to invade New York through the Lake Champlain corridor. Their goal was to cut off the New England from rest of the United States, weakening American defenses and forcing a surrender. The British army, about 10,000 strong, marched towards Plattsburgh, New York, while their powerful naval fleet sailed down the Lake Champlain to support the invasion. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, placed their hopes on Commodore Thomas McDonough, a young but brilliant naval commander. On September 11, 1814, as British forces reached Plattsburgh, Macdonough and his fleet engaged the British Navy in a fierce battle on the waters of Lake Champlain. In a stunning display of tactical brilliance, Macdonough used the lake's narrow geography to his advantage, maneuvering his ships to outgun and outflank the British. After hours of intense fighting, the British fleet was destroyed or forced to surrender. This unexpected American victory changed everything. With their naval support gone, the British Army had no choice but to retreat back to Canada. The defeat at Lake Champlain shattered Britain's invasion plans in the north and forced them to reconsider their strategy. But while the war was turning in America's favor, the British were preparing one final massive assault in the south, an attack that would make a national hero out of one man, Andrew Jackson. Far from the northern battlefields, the British had set their sights on New Orleans, a crucial port city at the mouth of Mississippi River. If the British could capture it, they could sever American trade routes and gain control over the South. Standing in their way was Major General Andrew Jackson, a tough, no nonsense military leader with a reputation for bold and ruthless tactics. Jackson had spent months preparing New Orleans defenses, rallying an unlikely army of frontiersmen, free black soldiers, Native American allies, and even pirates led by Jean Lafitte. On January 8, 1815, the British launched their full scale assault. With nearly 8,000 well trained troops, they expected a swift victory over Jackson's ragtag force of about 4,500 men. but Jackson had the advantage of strong defensive positions. As British troops marched in formation across open fields, they were met with a devastating wave of American gunfire, artillery, and sharpshooters. Within 30 minutes, the battlefield was littered with British casualties, including their commanding general, Sir Edward Pakenham. By the time the smoke cleared, the British had suffered over 2,000 casualties, while the American lost fewer than 100 men. It was a stunning and overwhelming victory for the United States, and Jackson instantly became a national hero. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the war had technically ended. Unknown to both sides, a peace treaty had already been signed weeks earlier in Europe. But the victory at New Orleans boosted the American morale and created a sense that the United States had decisively won the war, even though the official treaty told a more complicated story. With the battles over, it was time to settle the conflict once and for all. While the United States celebrated the victory and hailed General Andrew Jackson as a national hero, the war itself had been largely fought over issues that were never truly solved. In December 1814, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed in Belgium, officially ending the war. Both sides agreed to return to the status quo pre war territorial boundaries and no significant territorial gains for either side. There was no mention of the key issues that had originally sparked the war: imprisonment of American soldiers by Britain, the British support of Native Americans' resistance along the frontier. Essentially, the Treaty of Ghent ended the war with no clear victor. The US didn't get Britain to stop imprisonment, and British didn't gain control of the American frontier. Both sides had fought to a stalemate, and while there was no loss of territory, neither had really won anything of significant consequence. But the Battle of New Orleans had become a powerful symbol of American resilience. Jackson's victory gave the impression that the United States had decisively won the war, and Americans celebrated it as a triumph for national pride and sovereignty. It became a rallying cry for the fledgling nation, reinforcing a sense of independence and strength. The war also had far reaching consequences for American politics and identity. The Federalists, who had opposed the war from start, were seen as unpatriotic and out of touch with the growing nationalism of the country. Their opposition to the war led to the party's collapse, and the era of good feelings began with the dominant Democratic Republican Party. The war proved that United States could defend its sovereignty against one of the most powerful nations in the world. It sparked a renewed sense of nationalism symbolized by the Star-Spangled Banner and Jackson's victory. The war had hurt American trade, but in its aftermath, there was a surge in manufacturing and industrial growth, particularly in the North, as nations realized the importance of being more self-sufficient. While the war did not directly address the Native American sovereignty, it contributed to the further displacement of native tribes. The British had supported Native Americans' resistance, but after the war, the US was free to continue its westward expansion, which devastated native communities. In the end, while the War of 1812 didn't result in major territorial changes or a decisive military victory, it played an essential role in shaping America's future. It solidified the country's independence, established Andrew Jackson as a national figure, and set the stage for economic and political transformation in the decades to come. Thus, the War of 1812 was an unexpected victory, one of that sealed America's status as a true independent nation and laid the groundwork for nation's future growth, despite the uncertainties and compromises that marked its conclusion. And that, folks, was the episode. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, rate, and share US history, understanding this country. Your support keeps this journey through the history going, and I appreciate every listener who joins in. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, bye from Santosh.